Now on BBC Two, a special extended edition of Newsnight with Jeremy Vine.
A massive, unexpected attack on America. Thousands may be dead in what's being called the second Pearl Harbor. Tonight, the United States and the world are in shock. Good evening. The world has never before seen terrorism on the scale America experienced today. The World Trade Center had been struck by one hijacked plane when another with passengers on board flew directly into it. This a moment of spectacular destruction and horror. The president, who'd just seen it, looked shaken.
Today we've had a national tragedy. Two airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
But then came the news that the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. had been hit as well by a third hijacked plane, again to devastating effect. And this was the moment that made the destruction complete. The World Trade Center, where at least 20,000 people work, collapsed. A symbol of American financial dominance destroyed, with as yet untold loss of life. We'll discuss who might have done this, how the US might react, and we'll hear from New York and Washington on what's happening there now. The US has been shaken to its foundations today, and the world may now be a changed place. The sheer scale of the terror and destruction visited on one of the world's most powerful cities was unimaginable, but no less sickening for that. At first, it looked like it must have been an appalling accident, a passenger plane crashing into one of the twin towers of the World Trade Center. But then it became clear this was no accident, but an attack on the centers of American financial, political, and economic power. The fact that there is still not even an estimate of the numbers dead defines the human tragedy. In a moment, David Sells will describe what happened, but first we go live to the scene in New York, and our correspondent, Stephen Evans. Stephen, we're receiving reports now of another building collapsing.
That's right, Jeremy. A third building has collapsed. We had the collapse of the two main towers about an hour after the actual explosion, which was about 9:15 in the morning. If you wanted to calculate a time to cause maximum disruption, you would calculate that time as the start of the working day and perhaps the biggest, busiest complex in the world. There were those two explosions. I was at the base of one of those buildings and it literally shook. Then people fled out, fled away. One of the problems, it seems to me, is that people didn't quite know how far to go. So then the emergency services starting to arrive, and the collapse of the building happened, of one of the buildings, one of the initial buildings, happened when people were actually quite close to it. But you're absolutely right. We've now had this third building falling to the ground. It is very difficult to imagine anything standing at the end of it all in this complex of 7 buildings. If you think back to the Canary Wharf bombing in the Docklands of London, for example, it was one bomb. One imagines that most of the damage was superficial, if you like, not to the structures themselves, to glass, to furniture. Looking at that scene this morning here in New York, it's hard to imagine anything surviving those two explosions.
Can there be any kind of rescue operation here, given what's happened?
I can't imagine that there will be any kind of rescue operation. It's absolutely impossible to estimate the kinds of numbers under that kind of debris. 50,000 people, as I say, work in those buildings. But one of the problems, it seems to me, and I was just alluding to it, is that the emergency services got there rapidly. There were hundreds of ambulances and fire trucks very, very quickly there. People assumed that the thing was contained. People assumed that there was a series of explosions quite high up in the buildings, and realized quite late, if you like, that actually the thing wasn't contained and the engineering couldn't cope with the force of those blows. So there will be high casualties from the initial attacks, but there may well be casualties from later. I don't know if the lifts were working or not, but I imagine there would have been people who simply couldn't have got down those 110 stories after the attacks. So, as I say, the authorities are now very, very wary indeed. They have structures barely standing amongst the 4 that are now remaining. So I would imagine that they're standing back and trying to make engineering assessments of what can be done. Meanwhile, in the rest of the city, there is an eerie calm here. I'm on Times Square. It's normally one of the busiest parts of this city. You can see it now. There's virtually nobody there. It's normally blasted with adverts. They've, by and large, been turned off. That's partly because the city's been closed so that ambulances can get from the World Trade Center to hospitals, but it's also because people have simply gone home. There wasn't panic when those bombs went up. People were very orderly. There was fear in their voices. Their eyes were getting moist, but people weren't really screaming like you think they might have been screaming. But they've now had, 9.5 hours to think about this thing, and these things do take time to actually sink into your brain. There's a bit of anger about. The American networks are talking about, they're using captions like the attack on America. They're using the words Pearl Harbor quite a lot. They're talking about incidents galvanizing action.
Okay, Stephen Evans in New York, thank you very much indeed. We're joined now as well by Tom Carver in Washington. Tom, what have you been hearing from the American government just in the last hour or so?
Let me tell you what's happening is that George Bush is due to be flying back here, will arrive back here, we assume, within the hour. He's been at an Air Force base in Nebraska, where he's been convening an emergency meeting of the National Security Council by phone. His Vice President, Dick Cheney, is down in what they call the Situation Room underneath the White House with Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor. A number of steps have been taken. The borders of America have been sealed off. The National Guard has been alerted and activated in certain places. And around the world, American forces have been put on the highest form of alert. Later tonight, once George Bush gets back here, he will be making a television address to the nation to obviously try to restore calm and confidence in government. In these moments of history, really, in America, that's when Americans turn to the president.
Right.
Congress seems almost irrelevant and indeed has been evacuated.
Tom, we can see, we're just watching pictures now of the damage to the Pentagon. Are you clear as to the extent of that?
No, I'm not. No, I don't think anyone is. You may be able to see behind me that the smoke is still burning as I speak from the Pentagon. There's a full-scale emergency going on just across the river there, where firemen are trying to dig out the dead and the wounded from the Pentagon. Basically, we understand what happened was that the plane slammed right into the base of one side of the Pentagon and brought all 6 stories of that side of the building down. There were a number of very senior naval officials based in that area. We don't know as to the casualties, but obviously it's going to be quite a few.
Tom Carver in Washington, thanks very much indeed. We're now joined by Orla Guerin in Jerusalem. Orla, there significantly hasn't been universal condemnation of this attack in the Middle East, has there?
Well, the reaction has varied from country to country. We have had condemnation from countries like Syria and also from Iran, although in Iraq joyous music has been played on state television. I suppose the response that most people have been keen to see is what came from the Palestinians. Now, we had what appeared to be a very genuine statement from a seemingly very shocked Palestinian leader, Yasser Arafat. He appeared to be just as stunned by these events as all the rest of us. And he said that he was deeply saddened, that it was completely unacceptable, and he offered the sympathy of the Palestinian people. We had various militant Islamic groups, Palestinian groups, rushing forward to say that they were not involved, to deny any kind of connection, although they also did argue that in effect the United States was reaping what it had sown, that it was paying the price for its own policies here in the Middle East, which had caused so much anger. We also did have some limited scenes of celebration, quite shocking scenes in a way, but they were quite small scale. We had some people out on the streets in the West Bank town of Nablus and some here in Jerusalem. But to put that in its context, this was limited. It was not spontaneous mass rejoicing across the West Bank and Gaza. Most Palestinians appear to have been in their homes, glued to their television sets, just like most people everywhere, watching these events unfold with horror. And I think that very many Palestinians will be hoping that there is absolutely no connection to them, to any militant Palestinian groups, and they'll be hoping that in the end that they do not have to pay any kind of price for this.
Orla Guerin, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us from Jerusalem. Let's now join Martha Carney in Downing Street. What is going on there at the moment, Martha?
Well, the Prime Minister spent the evening talking to other world leaders, to President Chirac, Monsieur Jospin in France, to Gerhard Schröder in Germany, and he's just been talking to Vladimir Putin in Russia. The idea being to try and coordinate some kind of international response to this kind of terrorist outrage to ensure that it doesn't happen again. Earlier this evening, he was also chairing a COBRA meeting, which is the kind of contingency planning meeting of senior ministers to look at all the different measures that need to be taken in this country in terms of responding to what happened in the United States. And after that meeting, he emerged and made this statement from within Downing Street.
This is not a battle between the United States of America and terrorism, but between the free and democratic world and terrorism. We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy, and we, like them, will not rest until this evil is driven from our world.
Now, after that very strong statement of support for the United States, he also outlined a number of measures which are going to be taken in this country. He said that security was going to be stepped up at every level. No flights would leave Britain unless maximum security could be guaranteed. Aircraft would no longer be allowed to cross central London, and private flights could only go ahead with special permission, and security is being stepped up at government and military buildings throughout the country, and of course at military bases. Now, that COBRA committee I was talking about, the Contingency Planning Committee, are going to meet at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. It will include the Foreign Secretary, the Home Secretary, and also Alan Milburn, the Health Secretary, which gives you an idea of some of the kind of emergency planning that is now going on.
Martha Carney in Downing Street, thank you very much indeed. We'll be speaking to all the guests here in the studio very shortly, but first David Sells has this report on the terrible events of the day as they unfolded hour after hour.
Doomsday in Manhattan, a terrorist apocalypse. 2 hijacked airliners with 156 people aboard are steered deliberately into New York's tallest building.
Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
The first plane struck the North Tower of this giant building, 110 stories high, one of the city's landmarks. It was just before 9 in the morning. A BBC correspondent, Stephen Evans, was in the Trade Center when it happened.
There was a huge bang. It felt to me like somebody dropped a skip full of rubbish, a great container full of rubbish from a very great height. At which point, smoke appeared everywhere, as though a mist had suddenly settled on the building. We all streamed out, some people running, some people crying, nobody really screaming, across the road, and you look up and you can see the top of one of the towers, smoke billowing out from it.
18 minutes later, the second plane was guided into the centre's South Tower, already a terrorist exploit without parallel, of uniquely murderous intent and clearly well planned.
I was just standing here watching the World Trade Center after the first plane hit. I just saw a second plane come in from the south and hit the South Tower, halfway between the bottom and the top of the tower. It's got to be a terrorist attack.
We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. And I turned to Hesh. I said, this is it. We're dead. We're not going to make it out of here. I took a fire extinguisher and I bust the window out. That's when this gentleman here heard my cries for help.
And this was only the beginning. Within the hour in Washington, D.C., the capital, a third hijacked airliner is crashed into the Pentagon, the very heart of this superpower's military establishment, a symbolic target par excellence. Thus was America humbled. 24,000 people work in the Pentagon. All survivors had to be evacuated. In New York City, just a few moments later, the BBC's Stephen Evans was telling his tale.
People were just
just standing around, talking at each other, nodding their heads.
Oh, guys, going!
Oh my God. We gotta go.
It was a tale of the unexpected. The Trade Center's South Tower, much weakened, collapsed as he spoke, showering rubble into the streets below. 50,000 people work in this vast complex. Nobody yet knows the death toll. The scene was one of chaos. The world was already watching on live television, and reports were now coming in of a fourth airliner crashing in Pennsylvania. A passenger using his mobile phone had called desperately to say, "We're being hijacked, we're being hijacked." And back in New York, survivors in the Trade Center's second tower, seeing what had just happened to the first, began seriously to panic. Some waved, some jumped to almost certain death.
And there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess, because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know. And I don't know, everybody just doesn't know where to go. They won't let, everything is blocked off. You can't even, they're telling us to get out, but there's nowhere to go.
Manhattan and Washington shut down. America closed all its airports, and world leaders began to react.
There have been the most terrible, shocking events taking place in the United States of America within the last hour or so, including 2 hijacked planes being flown deliberately into the World Trade Center. I'm afraid we can only imagine the terror and the carnage there, and the many, many innocent people that will have lost their lives.
Manhattan was in turmoil. New York's go-go mayor, Rudolph Giuliani, was soon on the spot. The damage he saw was epic, and he spoke of a tremendous number of lives lost.
The number of casualties will be more than any of us can bear, ultimately. And I don't think we want to speculate on the number of casualties. The effort now has to be to save as many people as possible. And I don't think we will know the answer to that until sometime tomorrow or the next day.
Were there large numbers of firefighters?
We don't know how many we've lost, but there's no doubt we've lost some firefighters and police officers.
And no wonder, while firefighters and policemen were doing their utmost to cope with the collapse of the Trade Center's first tower to rescue people trapped inside, the second tower, mortally wounded by its hijacked airliner, also crumbled to dust. New Yorkers were shell-shocked.
What happened, man?
Big boom, come down the steps, everything fine till we got to the basement, and then everything just fell in. I got trapped in there with another guy, crawled out, kept getting hit in the head, bounced all around. Finally, we clawed our way out over the rubble.
Yeah.
Come on down. We did all right.
All right, way to be, Tom. Let's go.
A picture of devastation and a terrible reminder of how vulnerable in today's world of terrorism and suicide bombers its dominant power has proved to be. President Bush's expensive dream of a Star Wars missile defense scheme would have been powerless today. Heaven knows what the toll of death and injury will prove to be.
Let's speak first of all to Elaine.